Okay, I'm Bill Sherman. I'm director of the Warburg Institute. It's a real pleasure to invite everybody here to this interesting question: is Charles Holden's Warburg a good building? And Charles Holden, for me, was not a very well-known person. I probably saw his work every day without knowing it, without knowing who he was. But I came here from the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I was very inspired by working in an environment that had a master plan. And it had a 19th century master plan that followed the Great Exhibition in 1851, very much the work of Prince Albert himself, which is why the neighborhood became known as Albertopolis. And the idea of Henry Cole, in particular, his right-hand man and really government agent, of building a campus of complementary institutions was a really important driving force for us, even now, working in what is now the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, Natural History Museum, etc., Imperial College, all of those institutes together as a master plan. And it was one of the things I was sorry to leave behind when I moved across town to Bloomsbury. But I discovered there's another master plan and another person behind it. And in many ways, the Bloomsbury University of London estate is a master planned estate by Charles Holden. And as you can see here, this is the zone that we're inhabiting. We ourselves now are right here on the edge of Woburn Square, on the northern end of what would have been this massive estate going from roughly British Museum up to UCL. And of course, it also takes advantage of Bedford Square, Russell Square, Woburn Square, Gordon Square, and Tavistock Square. Lots of squares in this area. And this is really the massively, almost fascist style that he developed. Sorry. I know. Just wait. Your turn will come. Lovely. It's the lovely, massive style in 31. And then, of course, this is the second version in 1937. And Eitan is the expert, and he will talk about this. I shouldn't even have said anything about Holden in his presence, but this is where we are now. And this was the slightly different version from 1937 with this garden courtyard kind of approach that leads down to a much smaller complex around Senate House. And so that was 1937. Well, 1957, 1958 is when it opens. This building that we're sitting in now is opened, and this is Charles Holden's Warburg Institute, as built and as inhabited now. 60 years later, we have an opportunity to do some changes and to rethink a few things about it. And it's been incredibly interesting for us to talk to architects of various kinds, architectural historians, but of course also the people who have worked here for many years. And we have certain people in the audience who've worked here for decades and decades. And thinking quite a lot about what works in the building and what doesn't work in the building. So as soon as I knew that Eitan was going to be passing through London, I thought this is a great opportunity for us to really reflect collectively on this question of what does Charles Holden's Warburg Institute want to be next? And in fact, there are a bunch of questions, I suppose. You know, one is, would it be different if there were a different entrance on Gordon Square, let's say? Would it be different if you could come straight through and use the courtyard in a way that Holden, in some of the early versions, as we'll see, seems to have wanted to do? And so it's an interesting opportunity for us to think as our architectural team get going on this project about what works and what doesn't work. So we've asked here a group of people to offer their perspectives on this building and on this question. Is Holden's Warburg a good building? We're very lucky to have Eitan Karol from Lewis Karol Architects from Johannesburg, but also literally the guy who wrote the book on Charles Holden. A fantastic treatise that really everyone should buy and read. Hugo, Braddick, and Elizabeth Flower will join us in a bit from Haworth Tompkins, who are the architects working on the Warburg. refurbishment building, as well as Paul Batty, who comes from the structural engineers, Price and Myers, and Liza Fior from Muff Architecture and Art, architectural consultants for Warburg refurbishment project, especially focusing on, as Muff do so well, where social life and public realm meet the built environment. And then Neil Bingham, my former colleague from the V&A, curator of contemporary architectural collections, will also say some words at the end. And I, Bill Sherman, will just moderate and get out of the way for the most part. So Eitan, if you'd come up first, and I will open your...
All right, thank you very much.
And I apologize for the use of the F word.
No. I just must point out that that drawing of the very carefully hatched was done by my friend Stephanie Brooks for the original exhibition back in '87, you know, very carefully done in a Rotring pen. But Bill, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. You know, it's this thing of, is the Warburg a good building? I was originally going to change the title because I thought the title could really be The Warburg Uncloaked. But then, of course, I was worried how many people are actually Trekkies who would get the Klingon reference. So we'll go back to the notion of, is it a good building? And it's a very difficult question to just give a yes/no answer to, even though one would like to. And I think there are two questions, really. The first, you know, is this a Holden building? And second of all, is the Warburg a good building, really? And when the building was opened in 1958, Holden, who had been born in Bolton in 1875, was already 83 and very much in the twilight of a career. And we see him here working at his house on the piano, I think, on the South Bank scheme in those late years. And this was a career that had begun so fantastically, so strongly, with buildings such as the Belgrave Hospital down in Clapham, the Law Society, the BMA. And of course, he'd achieved such huge critical acclaim for his work with Frank Pick and the London Public Transport Board, which coincidentally, and that's another discussion, I don't really see as true Holden work. I think that far more so it's the continuum from the Law Society, 55 Broadway and Senate House that comes through the love of Walt Whitman, the simplicity of the Bolton Mills, etc. But when the Warburg was completed in 1958, the world was a very different place, and the building was hardly noticed except by Sir Nicolaus Pevsner in his great article in the Architectural Review, incredibly scathing, which he entitled Criticism, a Backyard Mentality. And of course, the great phrase that comes out of it was, the Warburg is a depressing building. But it's hardly surprising when you take the context of it being 1958 and that, you know, I know we're not supposed to have a teleological view of architectural history anymore, but the building was an anachronism. By 58, we're seeing Maison Joule by Le Corbusier, which of course was so influential in James Sterling and Gowan's work. And interestingly, Ham Common is one of the buildings that we see in Architectural Review of 1958. Corb had also finished by then his rather idiosyncratic church at Ronchamp. But the buildings that really, you know, to me epitomize the period are two Miesian buildings. First of all, you know, when one talks about campus planning and one talks about the universities, I think there's no image stronger than this. This is what every modernist looked for, where you would just clear out a swath of land and you would build this pure modernist building. And by 1958, many of these buildings were already built, and I think ITT was built, the Crown Hall was built by then. But to me, the building that epitomizes 1958, it's this exquisite Seagram's. And you can imagine that the average English architect thinking, we've got Seagram's on the one hand being completed in New York, albeit somewhat classical and inspired by Schinkel, compared with the Warburg. And most amazingly, Alison and Peter Smithson had already completed this very Miesian-inspired building at Hunstanton by 1954. But of course, 1958 brings us to the question, is it really a Holden building? The Warburg collection had arrived in this country, and correct me if I'm wrong, in 1937. And it was only decided in 44 that they would become part of the University of London. And of course, by the time that the Warburg Institute came to be designed as part of the University of London, two things had happened. One, Holden had already really retired from Adams, Holden and Pearson. And of course, the great master plan had been abandoned. And the master plan was one of the greatest things for Holden. In 1931, so he's what? He's age 56. He wins in limited competition against people who've mostly been forgotten now, except for Sir Giles Gilbert Scott. He wins it against Hubert Worthington and Alfred Dunbar Smith, both of whom remind me a bit of the old milk ad with Accrington Stanley. Exactly. And, you know, but he won this competition. This was going to be his St. Paul's. It was going to be his New Delhi. He gives the office the day off to celebrate, and he goes away for a few months to think about the problem. And I think that's a wonderful luxury that we don't have in architecture at the moment, where you get a commission, you can go away for a few months to think and then come back. And what he designed for this new campus, and University of London is a very, very strange academic amalgam of institutions. And he designed this grand scheme, which to me is the greatest Holden building. And it were these great courts. It was a great Portland stone megastructure. It stretched 1,200 feet across Bloomsbury. And to use that wonderful Whitman phrase, it was naked and unashamed. And the composition was dominated by the two great towers. Unfortunately, only one of them got built, and that being the Tower of Senate House, which you can see here on the right. And it was an incredible scheme where everything was subjugated to the greater whole. When you look at this design, you've got no idea what's a faculty, what's a department, what's a library, or what's an institute. And I think that that's something very, very important, that when you look at the great model, and I seem to think Neil introduced me to my wife over the great model. So thank you. Yes, exactly. So, you know, and, but this is what's important, I think, about the Warburg, is that even if the Warburg had been part of the University in London in 1931-32 when this is designed, they would not have had a separate identity. And rather, it was just this amazing and exquisite and quite sublime building, quite abstract in a way for a university. But by the time things happen in 1944, when the Warburg does become part, the grand scheme had already been abandoned. It had been abandoned in 1937, not, as most people think, because of the Second World War. And for those of us that are architects today, we would call it value engineering. In those days, it was just called cost cutting. And, you know, what you can see here is that the Courtauld was originally going to be on the upper floors, and then we get historical research, London day training. You know, everything just happened to get filled in on a module. But there wasn't even the money to build that far. And in 1937, as I said, this is the scheme that gets presented. And in later years, as I said, this is seen as the Warburg and Courtauld. But what is interesting here, and I think this is particularly important in terms of what we're seeing at London University, is that it used to be very much about positive spaces, and now it becomes a negative space, that it's this university garden, which I don't know what the university's plan for it is now, but absolutely nothing has happened. And it's this very lost space, which it was Pevsner in that wonderful article of Backyard Mentality said, poor students, These are the squares in which they will one day pass their leisure hours. But outwardly, Holden said, yes, it's a balanced scheme. Yes, I believe it's actually a good thing. But of course, privately, he felt total disgust for it. And, of course, not even this building was built. And I always think, I don't know why I'm mentioning it, but it's one of those things I always thought when I was a young architect and I came back from Sterling's Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart. My first thing was, my God, imagine if Sterling could complete that last quadrant. But of course, neither the quadrant is finished and Sterling is dead. And these were the early sketches that were done for SOAS, the Courtyard, the Courthold, and the Warburg. But of course, by this stage already, Holden was a very old man. He'd retired officially in 1954 and was only coming into the office sort of very, very rarely when his health allowed it. And I think they were very lonely years for him, both architecturally and professionally. From a personal point of view, his beloved wife, who he had rescued, had died in 1954, and his very close friend, Muirhead Bone, the etcher, died the year before, as had his partner, and his colleague who'd been with him all the way was Lionel Pearson. And architecturally as well, he was out of sync with the new architecture in England. I think it's one of those things, as you get older, you have very few colleagues left. And, there was the fiasco. They won the English Electric competition. Then they were forced to redesign it. J.M. Richards had attacked his City of London plan, and his South Bank plan disappeared almost unnoticed. And the other thing that I think was happening is that whilst being out of sync, his, what you would say is fascist, but I would say is absolutely lovely, Senate House Tower was being seen as totalitarian. People associated it with fascist architecture of pre-war Europe. And there was also the misquote that, Hitler's Reich was going to last 1,000 years. He was asked how long this building could stand. Could it stand as long as Oxford and Cambridge? And he said, we're building to last 600 years. And I think that the two quotes have gotten confused over the years. But, there is that lovely quote where Holford says that Holden loved every step of the tower, which I can quite understand, and I do too. So I think in many ways, the Warburg is not truly a Holden building. Rather, it was designed by one of the partners, Kenneth Urquhart. And, I think of the next generation of partners, they were always quite weak compared to Holden themselves. They never really understood the Whitman-esque connection. And they tried to reinterpret Holden, and I'm not sure how well they did it. And I was always told not to say this, but, the older partners always said to me that they felt that Urquhart let the side down a little on this and the student union. So we won't say that. But the building certainly, it is in the style of Holden, even if it is, I think it's a sort of a ponderous and quite mediocre neo-Georgian building. But one can understand the return to the Georgian. I mean, Bloomsbury, the fabric of Bloomsbury until Holden and Senate House was essentially Georgian in character. And it was Rasmussen, the Danish writer, Sten Elia Rasmussen, in his, I think, 1932 book, The Unique City, where he attacks Senate House. And, there's that lovely quote where he says, London University is swallowing more and more of the old buildings. Of course, the irony about that is, of course, Rasmussen was staying in Holden's flat in Woburn Square, and he looked out on these Georgian terraces and thought, aren't they fantastic? So I think you always need to be careful who you're, allowing to stay in your flat. But I think the sad thing about the Warburg is that, it's not clad in Portland stone, the great London material, and like SOAS, it's in brick, but to me, it's mediocre brickwork. Just it doesn't have the beauty of, if you take Holden's very early Little Georgian building in Soho, the Orchestral Association, the brickwork of, sorry, just two more views of the University Garden. I mean, if you look at that, that's a very elegant little Georgian city building. And what's most particularly interesting, and this is something that we see disappearing on the Warburg, is the statuary. I mean, as hard as Holden tried to get statuary on Senate House, and there's this lovely correspondence with all the officials of the university where they say to Holden, you can have anybody but Epstein. Who do you want? And he says, Epstein. And they go, all right, here's a list of 50 sculptors in the UK. Who do you want? And he goes, Epstein, which is basically why he didn't get anyone. And here's the beautiful Sir Christopher Wren-inspired brickwork of King's College for Women. And I think that this is really the inspiration, even though it's not as well done, are the substations on the Piccadilly line. And it's a simple brick architecture, and I think that in many ways is what the partners were trying to reinterpret again. But I think that maybe the Warburg shouldn't be seen in terms of Walt Whitman, of Senate House, or of Holden's style, but rather in terms of Holden's work of the City of London plan, where he worked together with Holford. And, you know, of course, I think it's very difficult for architects to work on master plans because all we really want to do is design the buildings. We're not interested in designing frameworks for other people to put buildings in. And Holden just wanted to do his buildings. And one of the things that you see in Holden's City for London plan is that a city is made up of fabric and monuments. And I think that's exactly what we've got today at the University of London. We've got the fabric, where we've got the Georgian or Neo-Georgian of SOAS, the Warburg, etc. And we've got the wonderful Senate House, which is the monument. And even in views like this, and I think that this is one of the most important views of what the Warburg could have been, because we see here that Holden had an urban vision for a campus. We get the very elegant colonnade, somewhat reminiscent of his work for the Imperial War Graves Commission, the vista, the classical vista, dominated by the exquisite tower, with the, I think, some sculpture over here, which can hopefully be seen, and the good neighborliness of the Georgian buildings. And I think that that is the greatest thing that was missed with Adams, Holden and Pearson's design of the Warburg, is that there's no sense of fitting into a greater campus. And I still have never been fully understood why the entrance was onto Tavistock Square rather than facing the University Garden. And as I've said before, I think the University Garden, and you can see that Holden drew the University Garden again and again and again, that this was the only way he saw that you could save the balanced scheme. And I would just like to finish with, obviously, the tower, because more than anything, as much as Holden might have said, I would like to build the balanced scheme is perfectly acceptable. This was his vision. This is what he really believed, and that is what it should have been. Thank you.
Great. So now we move to Haworth Tompkins. If you two would come up.
Live.
Yep.
Is that okay? You can hear me all right at the back? Yeah, I don't know if that's live as well. So we're here to give you really a working architect's view of the building. We don't come from the same depth of historic knowledge as Eitan by any stretch. and I'm looking forward to being educated on some of our questions later on. I was hoping, Eitan, you'd be able to tell us why the entrance is where it is actually, but maybe not on that one. So you're sort of amongst the Philistines, in Holden's words, in terms of a pragmatic view of the building as found. We're at the start of a process of uncovering the building, discovering the brief, and planning the whole project. So I think we'll start with the good and then move on to the bad. I mean, in summary, personally, I'm on the fence as to whether it's a good building. I think it's a decent building without being a fantastic building, and it's got a lot of good qualities about it. First and foremost of which is a very robust shell and frame to the building. So it's a masonry building with a heavyweight frame and a robust gridded exterior. So maybe Paul, if you want to say a bit about the structure.
Okay, right. As a structural engineer, whenever I come into a building, it's always a matter of trying to work out what lies behind the finishes, what lies behind the plaster. So it's really good to find a series of construction photographs in the archives here. And what this shows is typical construction from 1950s, which is simply clay hollow pot floors with a reinforced concrete frame. What you've basically got is a beam strip down there, and you've got hollow clay pots both sides of that. Now, what we also found in the archives here was the full bill of quantities for this building. So it says in lots of words exactly what's in it. So when I was reading some of that, I was surprised to find that we've actually got something, I'll probably have to point this out, but something unusual, which is actually this area here, that's a load of heating pipes, which are on the soffit of the slab. We don't know quite how they were worked in, but they're there, and they're there for us to take a bit of account of when we start thinking about the building. I think if we go on to the next one.
It's probably worth saying, I think John from Premises said that those radiant heating coils in the ceiling were working.
Sorry, guys, microphones, please.
Oh, right.
Sorry. Yeah, so those radiant heating pipes were apparently a feature of several Holden buildings and were working until something like 15, 20 years ago, I think he said. So they did work for a period and relatively successfully.
Yeah, then this is obviously the underside of the slab. What's unusual for me is I've actually never seen a slab that's covered in clay hollow tiles. Actually, they're half an inch thick, 12 mil thick, and it's quite difficult to work out precisely what's happening in terms of which areas are beam strips, which areas are hollow pots, and which areas are bits of heating. So this is something it's a bit of a mystery. It's something we've got to do a bit more work on, and it's something that we'll have to take quite a lot of account of, I think. This is just up on the top. This is the Slade. The construction changes slightly up here. This is what we've basically got here is a metal roof sitting on concrete columns and a concrete ring beam, which is slightly unusual. It's not something you'd do today, but it's a function of what was happening in the 50s. And because it was relatively soon after the war, the design was all about economy. So there's little steel as possible. Concrete was quite cheap, and you could get it, but steel wasn't. So you did reinforced concrete rather than steel columns and things in those days.
So as I've said, from our perspective, one actually great quality of the building is this sense of robustness over time and a freedom to be adapted. So a gridded elevation with large windows, lots of light. As I said, a heavyweight masonry exterior and concrete frame, and simple floor plates. Skipped one there. So simple open floor plates with kind of classic modernist concrete columns. But all of this adds up to a building that actually, as a building to extend, refurbish and adapt over time, and as architects arriving at that building, it gives you hope and joy, because there's a lot of different ways you can lay out a floor plate. And I think that's sort of, I mean, it's not a building of star architecture that's got whiz-bang moves and complicated formal geometries. It's actually laid out in a very regular way, and I would say we believe as architects that's something that for 90% of the buildings that you build is going to give it an ability to exist over time, be reused and adapted over time, and actually that durability of both materials and plan is a really positive thing in the building. And along the same lines, from our view to encounter the building today, it's actually a very neighbourly building in terms of massing and the lines of its facades. You know, it reinforces the moves around it. It sits very comfortably, I think, with the Georgian facades around. So there's a sort of sense of it's not a flashy building that's saying, "Look at me," and you know, I think that's an interesting and positive thing. And obviously, you know, there are nice elements to the detailing. So there's the brickwork is decent, although I agree not exceptional. The downpipes and the windows and the mouldings on the facades. So there are moments of delight and interest on the external facades. And I mean, we're not going to talk much about the culture of the Warburg today. That's not our area of expertise either. But it's wonderful, I suppose, to come to a building that in some respects is a box, and a rather dumb box, and then to find within it an incredible story, an incredible history of an institute. So certainly from what we've seen so far, that simple, adaptable, flexible plan of the building has actually done a job in sustaining and nurturing an unusual and eccentric library organisation within it. Obviously, a lot of what we're doing with the Warburg is helping to discover what that culture is and amplify it and improve on the good elements, get rid of the less successful ones. So that's the pros. The aspects of the building that don't seem so strong in terms of certainly the original design is its lack of permeability to the public realm and the street in terms of views in and out of the building. And I think one thing I was struck by is that, so the next slide illustrates that point, a lack of connection into the courtyard space. And as an architect today, designing in London, you'd be incredibly aware of the value that every square metre of land in London has. And the prospect of designing a 5-storey building in the centre of London and having a courtyard space that feels slightly like a service yard afterthought would seem crazy. If this was a new build scheme in our office, you'd be thinking very definitely, how can I use that space, create views to that space, and that space has really got value. And I think the same can be said of the moat around the building. You know, that as a formal move, it's very defensive. So that's definitely a bad side to it. I think that question of land value, maybe also you see that in some of the internal planning of the building. So actually the corridors are quite generous. We've got 2-metre wide corridors in the building, which again, on a new build scheme in central London, you'd be under all kinds of pressure as a modern architect on areas like that within your plan. So that's actually, you know, it's another plus in terms of flexibility and generosity within the building, although it's probably not how you do it these days. And then in terms of the condition of the building as it now stands, so there's a lot of elements of the current building that need repair. We've got services, systems that need major overhaul. The roof is in need of total overhaul, and this picture you can see the original roof lights that lit the Courtauld galleries on the 5th floor, which have got a potentially rather beautiful copper trimming and metal framing, have all been covered over with flash band as a fairly temporary fix to deal with leaks. Inside the building, heating systems, the fan coil units over in many of the offices are failing and in need of replacement. And I wouldn't personally necessarily look on that as a failing of the building design. That's something that happens over time to all buildings, that they need to be upgraded, replaced and repaired. And finally, just to end, to say that within the interiors, I suppose another criticism of the building is it's rather short, in my opinion, on moments of real delight. There are some elegant features and details to it, but the spatial richness that you see I mean, I go through Northfield's tube station on a regular basis, and it's an absolute belter. And that kind of dynamic section and the spatial delight and use of light there. You know, the reading room is a great space here, and the lofty floor-to-ceiling heights in the building generally are another very good aspect in terms of long-term reuse and flexibility of the building. But there's relatively few sort of visual set pieces that are there today, which is interesting. Eitan, seeing those kind of axial views through the master plan. You know, obviously Holden himself you'd have thought, very concerned with setting up views with real impact at a certain point, and there's relatively little of that, I'd say, in this building today. So that's us. An interesting and exciting challenge.
Hugo, thank you. Thank you, guys. Now, Liza.
Thank you.
There you are.
So, thank you for setting me up with this. So it's a pleasure to spend time in the Warburg, partly because it gives you permission to start thinking laterally when you're invited today. So I just wanted to start. So we have a new mayor, Sadiq Khan, and since he came in, there's a sort of a reworking of the London plan. So this is the rules for new buildings in London. And in the London plan, policy D7 is all about the public realm. And the idea that the public realm is the place where the big ambitions around equality and diversity be found. And so D7 talks about the public realm not as just the place that get rained on, but everywhere we can go with ease. So places of education, of libraries, of tube stations, for examples, museums are all considered, is all these spaces between buildings and spaces we can enter. And even if a building doesn't have a public realm, the impact it has on the spaces around it must be considered when people come to build. And so if you hang around here on a sunny day, interestingly enough, the pavement in front of here becomes a place with people using the Wi-Fi for free, having conversations sitting on the stairs. And that idea of these possible extensions into the street seem held. Also, there's a lot of discussion at the moment around the negative aspects of privately owned public space. But of course, the University of London does hold this whole piece of London. And we know that there are some positive aspects of control. So, for example, Coram Fields, you need a child to enter, a bit like a library ticket. Or in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the paddling pool is kept cleaner than any other paddling pool. And so this museum holding this other space. So that idea of the value of the enclave, I think, is held in thinking about the Warburg. And when one looks at the library, there is something about it, about this utility and sort of sensibleness, and then the unevenness of the fact of the cladding of the columns, which does hold a little bit of extra loveliness, and perhaps is the missing, the nearest thing to the missing sculpture within the building. And conversely, that proximity between the cared for books and the street, and that it becomes just the thickness of the glass that does separate you. So although Hugo talks about this lack of permeability from the outside in, the interior is almost offering itself out to the street. And then we look at the station. So if in the library, the preciousness is sort of held close to the street, I think it's the tube stations where we get closest to the idea of the Denkraum, the thought space, this pause before you've got off your escalator and you're about to face the day. And the preciousness and celebration that we see in the tube stations. This is Balham, with its own little candelabra. And then we come to the ellipse. So the built element in a way of the London version of Warburg, and that the Hamburg Library had, was this elliptical room, which wasn't a place for books, but it was a place for making associations in terms of the body of knowledge. And, you know, by coincidence, perhaps, we have an elliptical room in Piccadilly Circus of a Holden station. And that hanging around here allows you to start making associations. So Ishbel, sitting in the back, wanted to open up the possibility of what could that courtyard be. Could the courtyard be something between a library and a ticket hall? You know, could it be this place of preciousness, but also a place of meeting? And so it was Ishbel looking at braided hair that came to the idea of taking a rope, and with the rope, making, again, Warburg's ellipse in the courtyard. And it's a little bit lumpy, but after this, we'd like everybody in this room to come and stand within it, to just start thinking about scale. And again, the coincidences and overlaps is, this is a project by Muff in East Croydon, where we made a room, but we made a room that gets rained on. And it is, again, an ellipse, a slightly pointier one, which makes this place of gathering. Behind is an office building, 2,000 HMRC workers. And this makes a reference back to the neighbourhood and Great Ormond Street and Ruskin's Oval drawing room. So working with the Warburg has given a confidence for Muff, last slide, to start thinking about libraries again. Because one criticisms given is, oh, people don't need libraries anymore. They're not reading so many books. But perhaps the very value of the library is it offers a space that isn't home and isn't the city. And so my last slide is this room that's never used on the first floor of Essex Road Library in Essex Road N1, and the sort of paucity of the quality of what a library looks like today. And I think maybe in the sort of not quite perfectness of this building, there's actually, it gives a sort of freedom of possibilities to think beyond it. So I look forward to seeing you standing in the midst of the rope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liza.
Brilliant.
I think that's a good image to leave open as we get some reflections from Neil Bingham.
Oh, am I here to reflect? Okay. I think the real reason I've been asked here is because I'm not a reflective person in any way. I'm much more of a connector. And I've put Eitan together with Bill. And not only that, of course, I did put Eitan together with his wife, and now they have 3 children, 5 children, excuse me. And I do, just to say it, I do remember the moment, because remember we were sitting in the lecture in Senate House, and who was sitting beside us? Gombrich was sitting beside us, of all people. So, I mean, that's the connection. And I must say it's fascinating because I've watched Eitan grow up and move through the archives of Holden at the same time. But what I find fascinating is that when it's rare to meet a speaker who actually shits on a building by their architect. So I really thought you were going to stand up and give us this really positive thing about it. One thing if I have to reflect, the one thing I would argue is that a lot of the times what we see here in a discussion is we're always dealing with the facadism, we're dealing with the elevations outside. So that when Eitan speaks about, and you as well, we're always speaking about the outside. And rarely about the plan. I don't think the word plan has actually even come into this conversation today. And the workability of that plan. And so we have people here who work in this building. These are the people who can tell us, does this building work? Is this a successful building? We're making only an aesthetic judgment of oh, it's kind of a poor second-rate Georgian building done by a depressed old man, who, and it's true because poor old Holden, has been sidelined by the 50s. All his colleagues are now Royal Academicians. He doesn't become a Royal Academician, does he? And that's the club. You belong to the club at that period, the Royal Academy. And it was a very conservative club, and he would have fitted in very well. They were his friends, the academicians. But at the same time, he's pushed aside and left. So we are in a depressed building, I'm not unsure about that. But the other thing I ask about the contextuality of the building is, we have Senate House, and it is a brilliant building, and I sat there and did my doctoral thesis squeezed up against one of the radiators with this wonderful light. And I mean, this is a fabulous building in the sense that the light pours in. I sit in my office at the V&A with like a prison with my little window up at the top there, staring through. You've been to it, what it's like, craving sunlight. And so there's a lot of success in that way. And then we look at, I think contextually, at the rest of what's around us. Yeah, Senate House is a wonderful building, but what else is there around here that is great? The church is with this little stump over there is a kind of a poor English, early English, piece of Gothic, for example. The Georgian pieces around here are very cool. It's not until we get later period, we get the Lasden here, that is a good building, maybe not, but part of this, and still part of the spinal scheme, I would say, and it's like that. And my favorite building around here is the Werner Ries, the School of Hygiene, which has really got the pieces of sculpture on it. I don't know if you've looked at it closely with the pieces with the mosquitoes to give you malaria and all the other pieces, all the other bugs around. So in a sense, this is a restrained building, but does that hurt? I mean, in the 1950s, Eitan mentions, we have the Smithsons and we have Sterling, but these are the hot young architects, and their stuff is being looked at, but the stuff that is really being built is by the conservative architects of the academicians, and this fits in very neatly with that style. So I'd argue, I'm not one to make these arguments about is it a good building or bad building. Last night I had to sit as part of a lecture on the other side of the square about Robin Hood Gardens, which is, many of you know, we're collecting at the V&A a whole 3-story section of it with 2 maisonettes in it. Is it a failure? Isn't it a failure? On and on and on. We're always asking this about a building and the time, and I get a bit tired of that question. Is it, does it work or doesn't it work? I guess that's important, but at the same time, I think whether the building is has a sense of enjoyment about it and a workability to it, I think, and what I see in this building, it does have that, right? And so I hope Howard Tompkins work with the building, and I'm sure you will, to fulfill this and enhance this in a lot of ways. My reflections.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Neil.